Styling strategy. So a lot of my, getting specifically into styling strategy and not just overall strategy, I design my strategies based on what's happening in fashion. And there are trend reports. And the trend reports drive me crazy. Because what usually happens with trend reports is there are people, research assistants, editors who look at all 500 shows that happen, probably more, maybe even more than 500. But the shows that happen in New York, London, Milan, and Paris. And then sometimes they'll throw in shows that happen in like LA, which don't influence fashion, I'm sorry, they don't. Or Beijing, or Istanbul, or wherever. And they're doing these reports based on that, right? And they collate, they're like human algorithms. They put together colors, they put together shapes, and then general themes. And what happens with these trend reports, and why I don't support them, is because when you're looking at 500 shows plus that aren't necessarily the most influential shows, you get a really diluted amount of information. So what I've done, and what's really worked for me, is I choose, it's also a lot based on my voice, but I look at, and from my conversations with other people in fashion, who are the most influential shows? I say that there's 20 of them, and that's it. I think there's around 20 people, maybe 30, who are leading our business, period. Miuccia Prada, Marc Jacobs, Nicolas Ghesquière at Balenciaga. Who else? Because like Marc and Miuccia, Alberry Baz at Lanvin. There's like Rodarte girls. I think they're doing really interesting things. Proenza. They're like, Rodarte and Proenza are like the next generation. Who else? I have like a short list of 15 to 20. And so what I do every season when the shows happen, because the shows is really what drives our business. Like that's when, as much as I wish it didn't have, it just is. It's like a fact, right? So I make my own assessments about, do you have something?
I was just gonna ask, do you take like your favorite looks and put them on like a board?
I do sometimes. I mean, it's not really important. What I do after I've gone through and said, okay, and sometimes it's people I don't like. Sometimes it shows that I don't like, but I can't ignore it because it's influential, and some of my clients are gonna be inspired by it. So what I do is I look at the shows, I look at their references and their inspiration. I look at like their casting, their hair and makeup, because all that can be really useful like when you're working with more commercial clients because they want to feel fashion, but they don't necessarily know how to create from nothing. And I can be like, okay, like this or like this, and like that, right? But what I really do is start to break down the show. It's not whether about I like it or not. It's more about, okay, this person is really influential. This is gonna have a huge trickle down. Because what happens is those 15 to 20 people do, and they end up doing the same kind of vibes. It's really weird. They end up, like last season, 70s. Everyone did 70s. Quite a few people did 70s YSL. And so you have to have an interpretation. And I'm like, what is my interpretation of that? What is my strategy for that? So when I go into some of my more mass market clients who are being inspired by that themselves, it's like, how do I do a cool version of 70s that works for their demographic? So that's how I create my strategies for them. I look at, okay, what are the trends? I also, besides the shows, there's the editorials. I feel like the editorials are less powerful than the shows, but like, Camilla Nickerson every once in a while, Grace Coddington, Katie Grant, who else? Mariam Lee, Carl Templer, they'll do a story that'll inspire like a ton of different designers, and they'll kind of roll with that. I feel like it happens a lot less with editorial now, though. It's like mostly show-driven, because shows have become such a big spectacle. But then there's also street style. And I was kind of like, street style was so big in the 90s, and I kind of like veered away from it. And now with what's happening with like Anna Della Russo and Kate Lamphere and all those stylists who aren't necessarily the most powerful stylists in their practice, but they become powerful in the way that they dress and their own personal style, that like Tommy Tun takes their pictures, and like it's become influential. That's become influential. And the same thing the paparazzi was, I want to say like 5 or 6 years ago with like the Olsen twins when they first started wearing like all that crazy. I had so many clients who were like, we want that. So I look at what's happening with the fashion blogs, like who are they following, who's influential to them. and then I make an assessment of who's influential inside of my crew, like who from my world, like, and some of the top people in fashion, who are we inspired by and who do we think is influential? And it's like, you know, Kate Lanphier, I think it's genius. She shows up at FIT and people are screaming like Madonna's there. You know, and I can't deny that power. And I think it's great that she has that. And I can't, you know, it's like, if I can use that as part of a strategy for one of my clients who has that kind of demographic, I want to. Like, I'm excited that there are some women that are inspiring people to dress again. Because, you know, I think in some ways editorials have become so untouchable that's why people are inspired by these women at shows, because they're actually real women wearing clothes. Not that they're real clothes, they're crazy fashion clothes, but they're making some sort of expression, you know? So they're doing their voice by doing it on themselves, which hasn't been happening for stylists ever. So that's really cool. So I devise my strategy based on what's happening from the shows. And so when I go in to speak to because the clients are also listening for, whether they're editors or whether they're ad jobs, they're looking for whether you know what you're talking about. And when you start sitting there and talking about the trends that just happened a week ago, they're like, because that's the stuff they don't have time to learn. That's why they're bringing us in. So my strategy is always to speak from that and like look at, oh, okay, what happened last season that would work for this client? Like, you know, because certain things will work for them and certain things won't. You know, like Louis Vuitton did the kind of like opium den, 70s YSL. I mean, it was kind of YSL-y. That's not gonna work necessarily at one of my teenage-driven brands. Like, it's just opium den is just not gonna translate at all, you know? Nor do I want it to. But then I kind of start to look at something like Balenciaga. And Balenciaga was really cool. It was like Camden Market. It was kind of teddy boy. Like there was a little bit of old Comme des Garçons in there. There was a little bit of Carrege. It was very fun. Like that kind of thing really beautifully translates to the demographic of a younger teenage girl. And I have a couple clients like that. So I kind of look and say, oh, you know, did you guys see Balenciaga? And then I start talking about, it's like, because my whole thing is like, I don't want to rip off Balenciaga. But I do like to look at, okay, what were their references? Let's get the teddy boy books. Let's get the Camden Market punk books. And let's start to really look at what works for and that's, you know, your strategy is like, okay, going back to the references and going back to the voice and the creative and the storytelling and how to do all that inside of your strategy. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Do you ever have trouble like translating, like if you're doing Teen Vogue, like a lot of people who read it do care about fashion, they know like 70s and stuff, but if they're not, do you ever have trouble translating, like if you're doing a 70s inspiration?
Yeah, so the question was, do I have trouble translating if it's for a different demographic, right? Than what the inspiration might be. I usually try to find something that they can relate to. Sometimes it's just not gonna work. And if the editor's asking me to do it, or the client's asking me to do it, I just tell them like, look, I'm not sure. It's part of that like giving your assessment, but sometimes they're like, well, I wanna do it anyway, and so you figure it out. It's like the puzzle situation. So what I usually do in that situation, if they're like, no, we want you to do 70s opium den. And I'm like, okay. So I just start to look at 70s and drop out the opium den thing and start to look at, okay, how do I do 70s in a way that's gonna work for a teenage girl? You know, that's gonna be inspiring. Because the cool thing about that too, sometimes working that way, is because a teenage girl's not necessarily gonna know all these references from the 70s. So I'll go and I'll look for musicians from the 70s that might be inspiring. I'll look for artists. I'll look for like other pop culture figures. I'll look at TV. Like TV and movies are great references for stuff like that, and especially for teenage girls, because it's also something like you can say, oh, it's inspired by, you know, this story is inspired by Ali MacGraw and Love Story, and then they'll go and see that. I mean, it's like a devastating movie, but. You know, but then they can go and see it, and then they can be inspired themselves, you know, and like start to talk about. So sometimes it's just about taking a general theme and then bringing in a very specific inspiration. So, anything else?
Just what you were touching upon about the inspirations, like if you were for a client, you know, and they're saying what they want, and you're thinking about which collect, like, you know, having ideas.
Yeah.
Are you keeping that to yourself while prepping the job, or are you sharing that with them?
Sometimes, like, it's hard, right? Because that's the gold.
Usually they kind of tell you what, from my experience, anyway, what exactly what they want, images, you know, everything together.
Yeah.
How people work off.
Find them. Well, and we'll talk about that in commercial jobs, because when you're working with art directors, they usually have a super specific idea. And what I do that surprises them is I'll listen to them, take their inspiration, and then I'll go and do my own. Because I have to kind of create my own story usually around it too, and I'll email it to them. Because usually I'm working, like usually we're not in the same place, so it's like I'll send them a whole presentation. And we'll talk about presentation a little bit. And just say, oh, yeah, and I'll be like, oh, I got your inspiration, and then, because usually also they don't have like a lot of hair and makeup inspiration, they don't have da-da-da-da. I started doing that with one of my clients last year, and they love it. The art director loves it, and but I'm super respectful.
Right.
You know, I mean, that's the thing, it's the like taking care of them, like, and usually I'm like, okay, I saw your inspiration, I'm inspired by your inspiration, and this is what I was, you know, and this is the research I did based on your inspiration that I was inspired by. And then they know it's like, oh, it's like I'm taking care of them. So it becomes, and I think it's really important, because you don't have to do it. You don't have to do it. You could just take their inspiration and work off that. But there's something that happens with us in our brains, I think as stylists and creative people, when we can do our own inspiration. It like completes the story for us, so we can powerfully shop and take care of the job. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah, right? I mean, that's why editorials, like I get so confused, right? Because editorials, we are hired on editorials and we are the directors. We take care of everything, right? Like sometimes we even hire the photographer, we do all the inspiration for everything. You know, we do all the clothes, and like we're working with the magazine editor, and even when I'm working with magazine editors who are like, oh, I kind of want you to do something like this, they let me go off and go there. And I bring it back to them and they approve it, and you know, we go back and forth. And then when I go into a commercial, and then we get all of our work off our editorial, right? Like all of our commercial bookings are from our editorial. And then we're in this editorial environment and we're not allowed to collaborate like that. Suddenly we're being, you know, sometimes it feels like being dictated to by an art director. And I'm like, well, why did you hire me? Like, because on these other jobs I do all this, and that's why they look the way they do, is because I'm doing all this. And now you're putting me in this situation, but I become wardrobe. I'm like, that's just not. So that's where I started thinking about, okay, well, how do I do what I do on editorials that work so well with the art director, in collaboration with the art director, build trust with the art director, and take care of them where they don't feel like disempowered? Because that's where it's like it's so about taking care of people and their psychology. Does that make sense? Okay. Anything else? No? Okay.
Why is there no money in editorial?
Because it's your marketing.
It's your name.
It's your marketing. It would be a lot, I mean, like, it's a lot cheaper than advertising.
That was actually one of my questions too, just to go into that.
Yeah.
Usually when you're starting out, as far as, you know, from my experience, like editorial that I'm doing now.
Oh, I don't get paid for editorial.
When you're going further up and working with higher publication, you're the lead stylist, still in editorial, no payment, it's just.
You're lucky to get your expenses covered.
Okay.
Lucky.
So it's just basically that.
And when I went into business school, I thought about this, and and I was like, why do I do this? Like, why am I doing this editorial? Like, I could be making money that day. And I started to get really upset about it. And then I realized, well, I wouldn't get the commercial jobs and the money without the editorial. And that's when I changed my thinking. I was like, okay, it's my marketing. And I totally changed my strategy for my whole business. And I said, okay, I'm only working for love. Vogue, US Vogue calls, which they do, I still do portraits for them sometimes. But you know, if they call, I'll do anything. Teen Vogue, anything, and love. And that's cut down my editorial. I also got to a place in my career where I could do that. So you have to get there. I mean, I shot every day doing my editorial for years to build my book and my voice and practice. But then you get to a point where you don't have to do it anymore. And you get way higher jobs, and you're shooting a lot less editorial. But then I know some people at the top who do tons of editorial. I mean, when you think of Grace Cunnington, she only does editorial, but she's on a really big contract at Vogue. And I don't think those contracts are going to exist for very much longer. Those contracts are done. Very, very, very rare. Very rare. I don't know anybody from my generation who has a contract, not one person. Since the recession, done. So, I mean, unless, you know, Grace Cunnington has been there on contract since the 80s. So, you know what I mean? So, I mean, but it's really good to know, right? Because you can orient around it. Like, you can stop moving like, oh, I'm gonna get the contract, I'm gonna get the contract. It's like, no, 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 contracts don't exist for our generation anymore, which is totally fine, it's cool. You know, because you figure out an editorial strategy in a magazine, you build a relationship with the magazine you wanna work for, you only shoot for that magazine, you can cut down your editorial time so you can have more money time, and you're able to really focus your voice. And I mean, that's what's really worked for me, for that. Let's see. So, you know, just to go back a little bit to like the shows and pop culture references, the more you know about fashion history and different cultural histories, the more powerful your strategies are gonna be and the more money you can charge. It's simple as that. And it's so simple, but it's just, it's like, that's like the $1 million question. Just know everything. Do your research. Yeah. Yeah, it's crazy. I mean, you know, when I sit with some of the best stylists, they know history, like rich cultural history about wars and things like that. And I'm like, oh my God. You know, but that's why they're able to create the stories they create, because they have this background. It's so awesome. So, okay. I'll give you guys a reading list for strategy, and let's see. Oh, so the other thing to say really quick about strategy is I recommend having, so we'll talk about the different types of jobs that we do. So I recommend developing your own process for each type of job, so you have a powerful action plan, like skeleton, ready to go. You have it memorized, you have it ready to go, like your assistant has checklists, or you have checklists, or you have a manual just for that type of job. You know, so for editorial, there's a bare bones operations logistics process that's done. It's written down, it's not just in your head, it's written down. And you could give the sheet to a monkey and a monkey could do it. Like that written down. Because then you can really focus on the creative for the client. And you don't have to worry about dealing with, I mean, there's always gonna be breakdowns, but then you know you have a process, and like test the process. Test it, test it, test it. I mean, editorial is really easy to practice on it because you're doing a lot of it in the beginning. And then with commercials, you just keep, you know, commercial jobs, you just keep testing it. Shows, you just keep testing it. And make the changes, have the assistants make the changes as you go, keep a manual. It sounds really nerdy and boring. It's so important. Because that way you don't have to worry about breakdowns that just occur from people not knowing. Because my assistant teams, I wish it wasn't like that, but assistant teams, I have them come in to learn and work with me. I don't expect them to be with me forever. They move quickly. You know, they move, usually once a year they change. And so the amount of time I have to spend retraining people is intense. And also, I don't even have enough time to really retrain them because I'm so busy being with the client, It's like, that's part of the reason why I'm doing this education. So it's so important to have your processes figured out and ready to go by the time you're doing these strategy meetings, because then you know what you're competent. It's the whole competence situation again. It's like you know you're competent to perform certain action plans.
By that, do you mean like day one, we're focusing on storytelling. Day two, you're going to the stores to find this.
Exactly. Yeah, so we'll go through it, like kind of the processes, like, even like things, I like to get really specific because I'm kind of OCD like that. Like, okay, I like to know my presentation is inside of Adobe Creative Suite, InDesign. This is the font I like to use, this is the background color, this is how big the pictures are, like that. So once you have that, like your assistant can move so much faster, and your teams, and you can move so much faster because you don't have to sit and recreate those every time. And they'll change and they'll do what they do, but you don't have to worry. You know, it's like a peace of mind kind of thing. Then you can just really focus on the creative because you're not having to worry about if the presentation looks good for the client or not. I mean, you're just worried about whether the content looks good for the client or not, which is like a whole different thing. So I like to get really specific about it because it's so helpful, really, really helpful. Okay. And then we talked about being able to execute the strategy you design, because otherwise you will never get hired again. It's like pretty much that simple. And usually, I was asked the other day, like, what do you do? Like, if you know that you messed up, if I know that I've messed up on a job, I usually just take the loss and move on. Because you really can't, like, salvaging it is so expensive sometimes. And it's like, and I'm also the kind of person, like, you take responsibility. Like, whether it's me making the mistake or one of my team members making the mistake, my team members are my responsibility. And the client doesn't care if my assistant messed up. It's my responsibility. So, you know, there are times, those are the learning times, right? Like those are when I really learn how not to do something. And I go and I change the process. And we're like, okay, this thing doesn't work. So we're gonna do it like this, because I know that this is how I fixed it, so I know that this does work. So it's really kind of, that was like a really, because I used to try to save it. Like, oh, I can do it again, I can do it better. And it's just like, they're like, they don't want to play anymore. But you know, and there's enough people out there, and the business changes, even though it's a small circle, like, and you can regain trust over time by like doing ethical, you know, being ethical and moving powerfully with other people. I've had repeat business that way too. So even in the beginning when I was learning, and it was like, oh man. But you know, also you outgrow people sometimes too, which is always weird. Like when your rates start to go up, and I've had to like call clients and be like, look, my rate went up almost double since the last time I worked for you. I can't do this anymore. And they either choose that I'm valuable enough to pay my rates that I have now, or they move on. And and I'll recommend people. I recommend assistants and stuff who can, or people that I know who are a little bit younger than me in other generations to take those jobs because I know that they are at that rate. Things like that. Okay, the inspiration provider. So this is getting a little bit more into inspiration. We don't need to talk about this so much. It's what we do. Inspiring is a lot of what we do. That's what our clients look for us to do. That's why they have to get inspired by our portfolio, right, in order to bring us in, and then they want the inspiration. And that's why we have to kind of know all of the background stuff from fashion and history, so we can provide the inspiration. Because if we don't know that, we can't be inspiring. And I mean, it's very, very rare. I don't think I've ever seen anyone who didn't have like an intense fashion knowledge and background be inspiring. And so I started kind of looking up, you know, to inspire is to stimulate. So the definition I have here for inspiring is inspiration is the process of being mentally stimulated to do or feel something, especially to do something creative. Inspiration is the quality of having been stimulated by something or a person or thing that stimulates. Inspiration is also sudden, brilliant, creative, or timely ideas. So I got really stuck on the word stimulated, because we have to like people have to be, you know, in my business school we call it perturbation. So you have to hit some sort of chord in them. And that's why the voice is so important. But you know, and our voice is really developed from the inspiration we love and the fashion that we love. So it's so important to figure out. If it's boring, if you're looking at one of your presentations, like this is what I do. When I'm looking at my presentation, I'm not like, oh my God, I love this picture. I mean, you see me do it stuff, right? When we were going through that inspiration thing. And I'm like, oh my God, how amazing is this picture. If I'm not doing that, I mean, not every picture is going to be like that, but if I look at my project, my presentation to my client of the inspiration, and I'm so bored, I don't care what they ask me for, they're going to be bored. They're totally going to be bored. And so, you know, I start to look at, okay, what stimulates me and what's going to stimulate the client. And usually, I know if it stimulates me, it's going to work for my client and the magazine editor. Sometimes you'll have different stories and it won't work and you might have to do it again. But, I mean, that's just kind of like part of the process as well of getting to know someone. That's why consultancies are so great, is because you get to know what inspires somebody, or you get to know that you're inspired the same way or in certain capacities, and then you can just hit home with all the inspiration and research projects fast. And it makes the process so much faster and easier. Okay, so there's two fundamental ways that stylists provide inspiration. The first one is research projects, which are the presentations. I only do research projects and presentations after we've got the job, because there's so much work. Like so much work to do on that. And I have specific interns and assistants that I work with only on research who are like really, really good at that. Like some people just excel in the research area. And so the research projects I have written here is a presentation that guides the client's image and thinking, as well as the creative teams. So when you do your inspiration and you do a presentation for your client, once they've edited it and told you what they like from it, you'll get real clear on the creative team you need to put in place to make it happen. And that's why it's so important to know lots of different, like I know some people who only work like 1 or 2 hair and makeup people. Like hair and makeup and photographers have their own voices too. So I like to build creative teams that are all sorts of different kinds of voices, because like what's gonna work for the teen brand is gonna be totally different than what's gonna work for the sports brand. or what's gonna work for a high fashion brand. Or, or if you're doing something that's heavy 70s, there are certain hairstylists who can do that hair, and you're like, holy crap, like that's their thing. And so once you have the inspiration chosen with the client, you edit it with them, then it becomes really clear about the team you need to build. Let's see here. Like I told you guys, I like to present the presentations are really important. We're luxury, right? We're fashion stylists. Even if you're presenting at like a teenage girl, $100 million, like $20 dress kind of store, we are luxury items. You gotta be in there and your stuff, and you want your presentation to look like something that would come out of Hermes. And it doesn't mean it needs to be on perfectly hand paper, but just like the fonts and like paying attention and being thoughtful about that stuff, it needs to be inspiring to them. It needs to be an aspirational luxury presentation. And also when you're presenting your inspiration, you want to make sure you're presenting it to the decision maker at the company. In the beginning, I wasn't careful enough about that, and I would end up like presenting it to an entire team, and suddenly there's a lot of cooks in the kitchen. And not everyone's opinion necessarily mattered when editing the inspiration. So I get really clear on who's making decisions, and I sit with them and do the inspiration and listen to because they're gonna be the ones saying yay or nay and giving me my check. So that's the person you're really taking care of. So yeah, make sure that you can pinpoint who, and even in the magazine, sometimes you're talking to the fashion editor, but you find out that the photo director really makes the choices. You want to make sure it kind of works across the board when you're doing any kind of introductory meeting. Meet with the highest, sometimes you have to do the meetings with the younger people to like get to build trust and get to the higher people, but it's always good as soon as you can to get to the decision maker, especially with commercial jobs and budgets and inspiration, all that kind of good stuff. So the other thing about the presentations is that you're holding your voice and the client's voice. So you want to design the inspiration presentation, the inspiration presentations to incorporate what their demographic and what they're saying as much as what you're saying. Does that translate? Okay, cool. And then the other part of what we do that's inspiring is our own packaging, I call it. So it's like, as much as I wish that I wasn't judged on what I was wearing, because sometimes I just want to show up in sweatpants and a t-shirt, we are absolutely being chosen, judged, and inspiring or not inspiring based on how we look. And I don't mean like whether we're pretty or not, it's about whether we're inspiring to them. And that can, it's like, I had one woman I worked for she was so inspiring. She wore Dries, Yoshi, Comb, like all the really cool intellectual brands. And the way she would mix it all together. And she was just so inspiring. Like, you would just be like, oh my God, like, you would be so excited to see. She's like, this older woman who's been producing for a long time, and you're just like, she's incredible. Like, not a drop of makeup. She wasn't anorexic, she like totally ate, so she wasn't like skinny, scary. And hair in a messy ponytail in the back. Like, it wasn't about being like heavily made up and groomed and da-da-da-da-da, but she had her thing. Her voice and she was inspiration when you even looked at her. So that's something, I've over and over and over again, it's something I'm really conscious about when I'm meeting with my clients, especially after you've been hired and you're there, but especially when you're doing those first meetings. You have to look like your voice. And that doesn't mean wearing expensive things. Like, I have on, H&M and Lanvin. Like, I still love to mix high and low. Like, it's just about your expression. So it's really, really important to put all that, and also to pay attention to your team, like your assistant team. And as an assistant, like, you're being judged. And like, as crazy and weird, it's like, we're in fashion, and that's what people do, and we do clothes and accessories and all that stuff, and people are paying attention, the clients are paying attention, and stylists are very careful, especially the most powerful ones, about what the people look like who are working with them. And I don't mean attractiveness, I just mean fashion, inspiration, style. Because it's important, like, for me, my assistants affect my style. Absolutely they do. Just like when I was working for the people I work for, I affect their style. because it's inspiration and it's just really important. I find out about new brands, I find out about all sorts of new things from my assistants. It's really, really important to, when you're in the business for 60 years, you can get a uniform and wear all black and do what you want to do, but it's like you have to earn the respect to get there. So it's really, really important, like packaging, like personal packaging and your team's packaging. So any questions about that? No? Okay, cool. So creative editing. So creative editing is involving original ideas and imagination to determine final content of a project or job. Do you guys want me to repeat that? Yeah. Creative editing is involving original ideas and imagination to determine final content of a project or job. So being a creative editor is like the essential skill for a stylist. Everything we do is editing, everything. Just like kind of like everything we do is strategy, everything we do is editing. And it's holding our voice and holding our client's voice and being able to edit from it. So like when we're pulling clothes for a shoot, we're editing. We're editing the collections to pull in the edit we want together to shoot. We edit models. When we do casting, it's like, yes, her, not her, or whatever. So we edit everything. The most important place I find, editing is the skill that allows your voice to come through. If you can't edit and hold your voice through editing, then you're not gonna get your image or your runway show or whatever project you're working on is gonna look just all over the place. Is that resonating? Okay. So there's two major things for creative editing. And I guess the second one's not as creative, but so you need to be able to hold your voice and your client's voice, and then you also need to have body intelligence, which I call body intelligence is being able to make the person in the clothes look skinnier, taller, longer legs, broader shoulders, whatever you're going for, smaller waist. You have to have the ideas of proportion. Even in Comme des Garçons, sometimes you gotta make sure there's some sort of waist or there's leg, like it's short and big and crazy, and you got like skinny legs coming out with like beautiful shoes, whatever. Like you have to have what I call body intelligence. Because, if you present a look, I've done this a couple times where when I was younger, I presented some looks to my client and they were like, but she looks fat. And she's a model, she wasn't fat, she's far from fat. But the way my proportion, my outfit, like I thought it was like really cool and artistic, and they were like, but our client's never gonna go for that. So I found even working with like the top people, like on the shows are a great way to learn body intelligence because you're working with designers on fitting models. And so you're really learning of like, how do you make the legs look longer? How not to cut the legs in certain proportions. And I feel like because I haven't really found a place that educates on that either. It's like you've got to go and sit with designers and just learn it. And that's what I did. I learned it producing shows because we would sit in fittings. We would sit in fittings at Louis Vuitton menswear and we would fit for 2 hours per suit. Like 2 hours of every little shoulder, the lapel, the arm, where the button's hitting. Like the shirt had to be like a 1/4 inch, and we would go through and do every tiny little thing. And that is the other part of the editing that they rely on us for, the clients, is to know all that. And it's like this kind of psychic thing. Yes, Nicolette?
But in dance class, that's what we learned. Like, that was probably the first thing I learned about.
Yeah.
Like, learning proportions, because you have to look long.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's all the proportions.
Crisscross the, like, elastics on your shoes, or have just, like, the single, like, the crisscross makes you look longer.
Totally.
Yeah.
And it's purposeful.
Yeah.
And it's like, and what's been really interesting to me is like, no one told me I needed to know that. Like no one's, I don't, even, not even when I was assisting, did anyone say, okay, you guys need to know how to make, we know how to make my body look good. And I started to learn when I was working with Maria Emily and Katie, it's like they knew how to work with the tailor to make the clothes look even better than they're already beautiful clothes, but they knew how to work with a tailor to pin and make everything fit even more beautifully than they already did. Because when you're putting on a model, it's a sample, So, but it's what makes them great, is knowing those kind of fit. So when you're editing, you're really looking at does this fit into our story? Does it fit into our voice? Does it fit into what we say we want to say? And if it doesn't, you bring it up and you say, oh, well, I'm not sure. I do it a lot in shows. It's like, oh, I'm not sure this look has to do with what we're really saying here. And then you can have a conversation with the designer or the decision maker about it, and you get clear. And maybe the voice changes or adjusts a little bit, or maybe you get rid of that look, or you do whatever, you change the look to make it work inside the voice. And then the second thing you're looking at is does she look good, or does he look good? Does he look healthy, skinny, tall? Those kind of things. Does it look bulky? So those are kind of the two places to edit from. Make sense? Okay. Let's see here. And then when you're creative editing too, if you're saying because another thing I do when I'm editing, and it's really important for stylists to do, whether it's editorial, commercial, or shows, or a celebrity, is that oh, well, Prada did this look, Prada did almost exactly this look in 2008 from the spring show. Because it happens, right? Where you're oh my God, that looks just like Miu Miu from 2 seasons ago. And you have to can it, because, those kind of reviews are detrimental. And in the stylist, the designer will be no, it wasn't. And I'm yep. And then I have to, you pull it up, right? You ground, I pull it up on styles.com and I'm saying look. And I'm it's my job to let you know this. And that's why having all the fashion intelligence and background is so important. Yeah, that's a big one. And it took me a while to be comfortable doing it because it's not easy. Sometimes there's a fight. Sometimes because a designer or the celebrity could be really attached to this dress, really attached to it. And I'm just I know, but based on what you say you want to do, you don't want to get totally dismissed because it looks like old Prada. And then at least you've spoken and whatever happens, happens. Okay. That was a question. Yeah, so editing is the most essential thing to what we do, but it's also the hardest because it's like we were talking about earlier with sometimes when you're working with people, you're just sometimes I get scared to say something. It's just sometimes you just are oh man, they're in a bad mood and this is a hard day and it's would be easier for me to just let it go. And then I'm okay, no. I really got this is my job to say something. And so it takes a lot of courage and it takes practice. But it's totally courage. It's totally being in a mood of courage and ready, and it's I don't want to say ready for the fight, but it's kind of you gotta be ready to go. And ground it with your stuff. And I don't know, some of my clients love that. They're totally ready to go to battle about it, which I think it's fun. It ends up being a debate, and usually we end up with an even more amazing product or lineup or whatever because we've had this conversation about it. So, and then just to kind of go over quickly what I feel we edit the most, the kinds of things we edit. We definitely edit our inspiration. We edit our fabric. We edit silhouette, we edit fabric when we're working designers. I love doing that. It's a super early process thing. We'll talk about it during runway shows, but we edit fabrics, we edit silhouettes, sketches, looks, photographers, models, hairstylists, makeup artists, assistants, stories, set design, and music. Sometimes I work on music with, the shows because it's so important to the story of the clothes. So I have to do that. So you have to have a little background there. Okay. And then we're going to talk about team tomorrow, so we don't need to do that now. Yeah, we're going to really go into that. And then the interpretation, we spoke about already, the types, how we interpret for our clients and our magazine editors, our version of fashion, or our interpretation of fashion, the trends, what's relevant, what's not, all that kind of good stuff. So that's really our fashion interpretation. And then the culture, really, you're only as powerful as your background, as your history, your art history, film, music, TV, culture. Okay, now we are in, so I want to just have you guys have conversations with each other about what you're getting from everything, just really quick, and then we're going to move on to types of styling. So do you guys mind getting into, do we have enough for groups of 2? Yeah.